for a couple of slides in. So what I'm going to talk about today is gauging our stress. So I will bring in a metaphor that's hopefully going to help make more sense of that, but ultimately trying to play off of what Jessica had presented on last week on giving us a really good understanding of stress and how stress plays out in the brain. So really appreciated that. And so just putting a little bit more focus on stress. And so this is just part of a series that we put together for the summer, just focusing on taking care of self, putting a little bit of thought and time, I guess, into well-being as we're going through a pandemic, but it's also summer. It's easy on days like today. It's absolutely beautiful. So it's not a stretch to come up with ideas of how to care for self, but that's the idea behind this. And we just thought it was a fun idea to try and make it as interactive as possible. So that's why we're here on YouTube and wanted something that would allow for some chat. So that didn't work as well as one would have hoped. I got a lot going on, so I will say that my computer is a little sluggish. Okay, now it's working, so it's probably going to skip between a few slides here. Oh, no, it's going to stay. So where we're going to spend our time together today is exploring the reason behind the topic, or why I thought to present it this way. Go a little bit more into what that metaphor is, and hopefully end with a few tools on ways that we might be able to do what we're talking about, is gauging that stress and using that to support self-care and well-being. So throughout the presentation, you can use that chat function. It's up to you on how much you want to share. If you want to share nothing, you want to share a little bit more, I'll put that in your hands. You're able to share what you feel you need to, but I can't protect that information. But ask any questions that you feel are relevant, and I'm going to leave it up to Jessica to moderate that and bring that into the space. If you're at all throughout the presentation or afterwards, just want to make some information available on just what are some resources, whatever concerns might be coming up. Just wanted to touch on some helpful resources in our area. So that, I'm realizing that it's cut off a little bit at the bottom. So hopefully I'll kind of keep an eye on that throughout the presentation. But I really couldn't tell you what's at the bottom there. Okay. So tips for getting the most out of this live stream. Again, the chat function. If there's something that's coming up, just a reminder that the no comments are private. And then just sharing your thoughts and ideas to the extent that feels comfortable. So as we're just coming into the space, this might be more for me more than anyone, but maybe you were rushing to get kids down to log on or whatever the story might be, but you're here now, ready to listen to a presentation. So I just thought we'd take a little bit of time just to use a pretty simple grounding technique to land in whatever space you're in. So what I would just encourage you to do is just maybe even just take a minute, just a deep breath, and just look around your space and try and find 5 blue things, whatever it might be. So let's give you some time just to look around and try and see if you can find 5. Maybe another big breath. And then, yeah, you can chat, but put something in the chat if there's anything of like, if that was valuable or just some thoughts on that. All right.
Bryan, just going through that exercise myself, one thing I noticed at first, I was like, there's probably really nothing blue in my space because as you can see, it's a pretty gray space. But then as I started sort of scanning to the left and the right, I was able to actually find 5 things fairly easily. So that surprised me a little bit because I didn't think that would be a color that would really jump out, but they were there.
Nice. And thanks for stopping me. I was going to move on. I got to remember that 15-second delay. I'm going to try really hard to, when I ask things, I might leave a little more space in between. So jumping into it, the idea behind the presentation is, trying to put a different spin on self-care. I think I don't know how common it is for everyone out there, but I do feel like it's a pretty common concept that gets thrown out, self-care, and it usually generates a pretty large list of what that can look like. And those activities, whatever they might be, they may be helpful, they may not be so helpful. But what I'll ask you to reflect on throughout this presentation is the idea of just thinking of some common self-care activities that you engage in, and then just trying to think of situations where they may work out and maybe situations where they don't work as well. And so I'll leave a little bit of space, even just bringing up that idea, if there's any comments about, yeah, sometimes it's helpful to go for a walk and other times not so much.
And Bryan, maybe while we leave the viewers a few seconds just for their video to catch up to our video, one thing I realized is I'm not sure that we introduced ourselves or where we're from during this presentation. So maybe we could do that now while people just start to kind of get a sense of what self-care options are good for them.
Yes, good catch. This is why you have a moderator. So I'm Bryan Bullock. I'm a registered provisional psychologist with FCSS in Coaldale. And
that's my cue. And my name is Jessica Collins McIntyre, and I'm also a registered provisional psychologist in Alberta. And I also work with FCSS here at the hub in Coaldale. And really, FCSS, we have counselors sort of in many locations all over Southern Alberta. So I know that as the presentation goes on, Bryan's going to throw up different resources about how you can get connected with our programs here at FCSS in Coaldale and Tabor and Raymond and all of the many smaller communities that we support here in Southern Alberta.
Yeah, thanks. I went back to the title page. For anyone interested, it is back there, those main numbers that can be contacted for the various programs that we offer. Thank you, Jessica. All right. So sort of, again, playing off that idea, like self-care, again, like this is not an uncommon thing. I had a picture on here that I used as an example, but then I realized, and I don't have permission to use this picture, so I took it off, but I'll just paint you a word picture. So what the picture was, is it was recently I'd went to the Philippines, and so it's a picture of me and my sisters in this little small village in the middle of nowhere. I can't describe it any better than that. But we're super, it captures all 4 of us with these huge smiles on our faces, and it just looks like we are having a great time. And we are. We were in this little village to visit a family who does basket weaving. And so they were really gracious to invite us into their home and feed us and show us, the business that they run. So it was a very unique and great experience. But what the picture doesn't show is what was happening before that. So we were, again, this is in March. So the pandemic had hit, and we had been in this van. It's the middle of nowhere because we were in this van for like 5 hours, lost. No one knew where we were, and we're getting information that airports are shutting down, and it's maybe we're going home, maybe we're not going home. So the stress levels, the anxiety levels are just ramped up. So you got the snapshot of this picture that just seems, we're having the time of our lives. And again, it was a good time, but it doesn't capture everything that was going on underneath. So that, I guess, in using that as an example, it matters. It matters how much stress we're carrying in that moment. How much were we able to enjoy that moment due to how much stress we were carrying? That would have been a way different moment if there was no pandemic. Maybe getting lost in the van wasn't the worst thing, but if that didn't exist, that's a way different experience. And managing that moment would have been a very different experience. So I guess my best way to explain that, I just looked at my notes and I was like, oh yeah, I missed a point. My best way to explain that too is what happened before that trip. So, before that trip, self-care looked way different. It was exercise, it was being active, it was eating healthy foods, and I felt great before that trip. That's not always the case, but it was the case then. And after that trip, it was completely different. The exercise, no chance. The pantry would call my name from the distance. The couch, I don't know how it was possible, but I think the couch got more comfortable when I was gone. But it's like that all shifted. Nothing, when you think about it from the outside looking in, not much was different. I still lived in the same house, still had the same job, family's the same. A lot of stuff was the same. But that experience shifted how much stress was there. So I'll open that up as I transition to the next slide. Anyone else, as I'm talking about that, any sort of distinct shifts that you maybe have noticed, just bringing that topic up in terms of stress levels and what seems possible in relation to self-care?
So I know this is another time where we need to just maybe give some time for anyone who's tuning in to type up what they may have to say or may not have to say. But if it's okay, Bryan, I'll just kind of jump in and let you know sort of what's going through my head while you're sharing this story and ask this question of, what are some of the things that shifted for self-care given some of the stressors that are happening for all of us right now. And so I even think about something that's happening in my family, but I hear from other families that I work with, it sounds like it's not that unique of an experience to me. But even when I think about self-care and parenting and self-care with my kids, like our screen time definitely has gone up. And in other periods of in our lives, it's been a lot easier to sort of manage the screen time. And, some of the frustrations my kids might express around structure with screen time and limits to screen time before maybe didn't seem quite so difficult to manage. But now there's times where I'm like, oh gosh, like go ahead, go watch TV for an hour, or okay, fine, you can play Fortnite for an extra hour today, where before we had a pretty good routine with it. But it's just those kinds of things. And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh gosh, like did our screen time double in the last week compared to what it would have been like before?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and it made me think of parenting too. That could be a pretty stark contrast when you think of what's self-care like when you didn't have kids compared to self-care when you're after that first kid. Way different. So I'll take that as that there's no comments, and that's okay.
No, there is some ideas being shared on the chat, so I'll just read them out to you, Bryan, so you can see them. And just a reminder for those tuning in, Bryan can only see his presentation, so that's kind of where my role comes in to sort of help him with the chats. But we have somebody sharing an idea here that even as an introverted person, it was hard to have everyone in the space at home all the time. So I've heard from some people that it was really hard to be away from people, but this person is saying no, like it was hard to have everyone at home in the space all the time. There's no time to like rest or get a break from other people's energy, so it's difficult for an introverted person for sure.
Yeah, I really love that example because it shows some great self-awareness. You could look at it on the outside and be like, it's just so good to have everyone here and have everyone around. But just to be able to reflect, and that's kind of the idea of the presentation, reflect and be like, but I'm carrying a little bit because you're a little too close and I can feel your breath, which is different. Yeah, like that. I like that. Thanks. So the idea of the metaphor is, going back to those examples and saying, why does it happen that way, or how is it happening this way? And the idea is that the tank's empty. When we're carrying that amount of stress, we just have less room for the other stuff. I'm seeing a smile. That's all. She's my gauge, just like the meta. So as soon as she's smiling, it's like, oh man, what's happening out there? But it's like trying to check in to say, where am I at? So the example with all these gauges here, if you get into your car or vehicle or whatever it might be to go, let's say to Calgary, and you get in and the tank's on empty, you're not going there, right? Like that's not, unless you find some way to get enough gas in there to get there, it's not happening. The trip can't happen. Conversely, or on the flip side of that, is if you get in the vehicle and the tank's full, then you're not only going to get there, but you can take the scenic route. Feel free to go through Bragg Creek and enjoy a nice day. There's just so many more options available to you when that's full, as opposed to when that's on empty. And I can remember being a kid and you'd go and get like $5 of gas. Then when you're just kind of scraping by, it's a lot harder to get to those places that we're looking to go. And taking care of self, the same idea. Again, when we talk about before these stressors were present, some of that stuff's easier to do. Maybe going for a walk, less screen time. Maybe a yoga class seems more possible, but when we're carrying a lot of stress, it just doesn't come as easy. So any thoughts on the metaphor or anything that sparking any thoughts? So I just want to check in and leave a little space for there. Maybe even Jessica has a thought.
Well, one idea that's coming up in the chats, Bryan, not necessarily directly related to the question you just asked, but something that I'm seeing in the chats is that, sometimes we can have sort of two feelings about something. So it might be difficult, for example, to have people in your space all the time, kind of like the introvert idea we were talking before, but at the same time, we can really love having these important people around and having this extra time. And it kind of fits, I think, with the gauges metaphor that you're talking about right now, because I mean, if my tank is at halfway, like I'm the type of person that I drive my car, I maybe shouldn't admit this so publicly, but I'll drive my car till the gas light's on and then I fill it up. I can tell myself, no, I've got gas, I've got gas, I've got gas. But with our emotional energy, it can go from like half full to empty really easily and really quickly if we're not doing things to top it up. So I just really liked that idea that I saw in the chat. And I do think it kind of connects to the question you just asked in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. If I'm hearing you right, it can be easier to connect with those ideas when the tank's a little fuller.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
Just like if you were driving, it's probably easier to have a conversation when you're not watching the gas gauge. Like, am I going okay? Am I going to be able to make it there? It just opens up a little more mental energy.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do we do this? And so, what I wanted to talk about is potentially looking at how to do this on a general level, and then maybe how to do this on more of a in the moment. So this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And honestly, the idea is just a framework. It's not necessarily following this exactly, but it's just to bring up the idea of when some of these things aren't present, it makes progressing up this triangle a little more difficult. But what I want to point out about this is what I think Maslow is trying to convey as well, is that everyone within them holds the ability and the desire to move up through this triangle. And I believe that. I believe that's present. But some things can get in the way. And that's where I wanted to focus the conversation on today. And that could be a life event, that could be a pandemic, that that could be a loss, that could be whatever it might, a shift in your environment. Those things can impact some of these lower areas and impact your progression of the triangle. And I don't think it moves, in a one directional, like that was the early criticisms of the triangle. It's like, I don't know if it really moves one way. It's likely more fluid. So I'll go back to the example of with my family in the Philippines. Is that had the potential to be a really nice self-actualizing experience, just living my best life, right? But that moment wasn't that. That I was there by myself without my wife and kids. So you're disconnected from family, and now there's this threat that maybe you won't be able to get on a plane and get back to them. We are in this 5-hour journey. I don't even know what to call it, but no food, so I'm hungry, and in that moment a little bit worried about not only food but water. Didn't have water, so that's those physiological needs start to be threatened. The safety starts to be threatened, that loving and belonging. Like, I did still feel that connection. I'm there with my family, but as those other lower levels, I don't think it's the perfect system, but as they start to get threatened, it takes away from that experience. And I wouldn't classify it as that self-actualizing experience, even though I can see the good in it for sure. So hopefully that's making sense, but just want to put it out there if there's any questions or thoughts on this triangle. But and as you're typing up or potentially typing up those questions, it's really just to give a snapshot of some of the things that might be involved in building this foundation of well-being and getting us to a place where we're potentially living our best lives.
Yeah, with the example that you shared, Bryan, it's so great to hear you share such a lived example, because it really highlights this stuff so well. And just to kind of reiterate what you've already said, but in the story that you shared, you really can't, work on something like self-actualization if your health safety needs don't feel like they're met. And in that, maybe it was health safety is maybe the wrong thing, but you just had all these things on your mind about sort of your stability and being able to make it back home and that kind of stuff. And so it really just such a beautiful example to highlight how really if one of those lower levels on that pyramid is missing, it really is a lot harder to climb higher.
Mm-hmm. And just on that note too, just talking it through, that's where there's some competition. So the base of this thing was just getting rocked. But some of the other stuff, like like the love and belonging that really sticks out for me in that moment because you're in this home and these people are super excited to have us there. This family was very open and generous and gracious and hospitable. Um, so there's some competition there, right? There's some fear for sure. And so back to Jessica's conversation last week, you're seeing tigers, but at the same time, you're like, wow, like this is a really nice moment of connecting with this family halfway across the world. So there was some competition there, but that foundation was definitely getting rocked.
Yeah, and my guess would be going back to the gauges metaphor. Bryan, correct me if I'm guessing wrong here, but if your gas tank is a little bit more full, it's probably a little bit easier to hold both of those things at the same time. Just like, the example from the chats, we can feel frustrated with not having enough space and still really cherish this time that we have with our loved ones that we may never get time that looks like this again, but it's probably a lot harder to hold both of those things as our gas gauge gets a little bit more empty.
Yeah, yeah, totally. So what this tool is like, how do I do this maybe more in the moment and in more of a like a check-in? How am I doing right now? How am I doing today? Uh, so this can be a quick way just to look at it and potentially take a temperature, a gauge, a reading on where those stress levels are. And I really like this one to bring back to the original challenge of some of the tools or some of the strategies that we're using for self-care and potentially starting to look at how do I match those up with where I'm at, you know, with where my gauge is, with where my levels are, whatever that might be. And so using examples off of this is my self-care might look very different if I answer the, or I look at this and I determine I'm doing pretty good. That might be leave me open to um, a bike ride or a pottery class, or I'm spitballing here, but I might be really open to new experiences or, adventure or things like that might really fill me up and contribute to my well-being. But let's say I'm having a really hard time. And that's way different. That's potentially more reaching out to resources or connecting with family or calling a friend or whatever it might be. I might need that in the moment. I might be more coping, and that's okay. Uh, but it would be a lot harder to do some of the other stuff. And so one piece of value that I see in this, but I'm open to discussion around it is matching those up potentially saves us from some guilt, potentially shame, just around what our expectations are. I should be doing this. I shouldn't be watching, when that next episode in 15 seconds or whatever it pops up, it's like that guilt of should I go for another one. If I'm having a hard time or starting to struggle and I'm just really needing to cope in that moment, that seems fair just to take that temperature gauge potentially allow ourselves that compassion. I'm not saying that we necessarily always want to stay there, but that actually might be where we are. So to get up and say, no, I should turn this off and go for a run, that might be a tall order. That might be a pretty tough switch if that's not where we're at in that moment. So I'll kind of slow things down. I don't know, Jessica, if there's any comments popping up.
Someone jumped in and said, cue the chips, which was a nice callback to the pantry conversation earlier.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I don't know. A public forum, I should keep it to myself, but man, Doritos had my name. So yeah, I shouldn't have said that. Can we scratch that out?
That's too late. It's already out there.
Out there. So I think that those shifts though in well-being, so this is back to what Jessica was talking about last week, is those shifts can be alarming. Because I think that can be, especially with throughout this pandemic and talking to people and noticing my own experience, it's sneaky because a lot of stuff is still the same, but also very different. Connection looks very different, but potentially you have a lot of other stuff that's still there. A lot of stuff to be grateful for, a lot of whatever it might be, but it's sneaky. And so it can create those internal shifts that aren't always noticeable, but they can be quite alarming when we're noticing again, the couch is a little more comfortable, the exercise is harder to come by, whatever it might be, but that we start to get those shifts and it can throw us off. So there is value, hopefully, in being able to identify that, take those gauges, potentially normalize things, and maybe that helps move towards acceptance. Potentially that invites in a little bit of self-compassion and hopefully builds up some resilience towards some of that guilt and shame that can creep in. And maybe that is hopefully a little bit of a tie to what happened last week with Jessica's presentation, a little bit of a shift towards what we're going to talk about next with Amanda and the 4 pillars of resilience. Any thoughts, Jessica, or any comments coming in?
Well, one thing I'm thinking, I'm just looking at this picture that you have up here, and even just kind of thinking about my own experiences. Like if I'm in the green, or if I go to if my starting to look closer to the quarter of a tank kind of place, and I have a hope or a goal to do something, even just like going for a run after work or something like that, it really does become that much harder if I'm in the green, right? If I can't do something else to sort of fill up my tank a bit or to bump my energy level up a bit, like a run might be something that could do that for me. But at the same time, if I have very little energy, the idea of spending that energy on something like that really starts to feel frivolous. Like I think we can almost go into like, I don't know, scarcity mode or something. Even just a callback to the tiger story from last week, right? Like if I'm seeing tigers everywhere, it's not going to feel realistic for me to like do some kind of act of self-care, because in my brain it's going to be like, well, I'm in survival mode, like I need to fight through this or get through this or get away from this. So it can be a really tricky balance. And I just really appreciate, Bryan's taught me this before, and just a reminder of him teaching this again today is that if I'm in the leading myself into trying to do something that maybe my system just doesn't feel like I have the energy to do is pretty high. So this reminder of, maybe if I'm in the green or blue, self-care can look a little bit different, and that's okay. It can be pretty helpful for me.
Well said. Thank you. So that, I'll open it up. Any questions that might be coming through? There might be some that we miss. Again, there's a little bit of a delay, so we'll leave it for a bit. But if we do miss some questions, I apologize in advance for that, but we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. I'll pass by that and just go to this last page again, just those resources. Jessica's going to try and cut in on me, it feels like, but yeah, if there's any need to connect, if anything's coming up, just looking to access some additional resources, want to make those numbers known of some of those excellent resources that we have in our communities.
Yeah. So with those numbers up there, Brian, there's a couple questions that I'll throw out to you, and we'll see how many we can get time to answer here. But one thought that's coming up is somebody's asking, so can you talk about why we're so resistant to change? I found that initially I was stressed about COVID, and then I relaxed into the new routines. Then with opening up, the stress was back. And now the stress is amped up again about school opening up in the fall.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I wonder if part of that is the unknowns in it. I mean, that's what comes up for me. I'll open that up to Jessica as well, but as those unknowns, we can get sort of used to it. Okay, we're self-isolating, I get it. Then we get used to that, opens up a bit. There's more unknowns, especially maybe even here in Lethbridge, you start to see some numbers go up. And part of that, again, might come back to that tank. I think that change it's a tiger usually as is, but it can be especially alarming when that tank isn't quite as full. When we have a little bit more room, there's a little bit more room for change, adventure, unpredictability, but those things in general are quite alarming. So I don't know if that answers the question or if you have anything to add to that, Jessica, but that's the thought that comes up for me.
Yeah, I agree with you, Brian. And then there's sort of a follow-up question. I don't know if it's meant to be a rhetorical question or if it really is like a genuine question, because I know I get asked this a lot. The follow-up question is, why is uncertainty so hard? And I'm even thinking about, we have a presentation coming up in August with Kim and Bryan. I think you're moderating that one, where we're going to be talking about temperaments, because I know for some people, uncertainty doesn't feel so stressful. For some people, it's kind of like, okay, well, we'll see how this goes. And for other people, not individual. So part of it can just be, part of it's just how we're made, and the different things that look like tigers to some of us might not look like tigers to other people at all. And I agree with you that, I'm someone who can have a difficult time with uncertainty. Like, I really like to know what's happening next, and I like to have as much control as possible. But when my tank is a little bit more full, it's a little bit easier for me to let go of the reins. But if that tank is starting to dwindle a little bit, then I want to grasp onto that control a little bit more. So I don't know if that really clearly answers the question or not, but part of my answer is stay tuned.
That's nice cliffhanger there. And I agree with you. I do think it's different for everyone. And that's sort of part of what you were inviting last week is just some exploration into those triggers. That one in particular, though, again, it might be different for everyone, but it is quite common, that unpredictability, and it makes sense because, like you said, it's a control thing. We like to be not like a control. We have issues with it, but it's nice to have things. Even when you want to know when you get into your car, it's going to work. You want, when you get to work, what you're going to do. There's a peace of mind in it, and there's a free up mental space for other things if we know what's coming. So it can really throw the system off when we're presented with unpredictability. But again, it can be an individual thing as well. Anything else?
It looks like I've just been watching the chats here, and so just some sort of follow-up points. Yeah, that kind of makes sense. Thanks. And Brian, you're getting some props, and people are enjoying the presentation. So It looks like we've addressed, from what I can see, we've addressed the questions. And if there's any questions out there that I missed, you might have a moment to retype it so I can see it. But as I scan through the chats, it looks like we've kind of wondering.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate the props. It's nice to know that there are other people on the other line. Like we've mentioned before, it does feel, basically, I feel like I'm having a conversation with Jessica, more like by myself, but so I've enjoyed it, and I do hope that that others have gotten some value out of it. So I do appreciate everyone that's logged on and sat through the presentation, and Jessica for helping out and moderating. You did an awesome job, so I do appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, and just a reminder, if you only got to see part of the presentation and you're curious about it, we'll have it uploaded to the YouTube channel. And if you aren't, we're talking about this as we're live, but if you happen to be watching the recording of it, just a reminder that we can't moderate the chats after sort of the live portion is closed. So if you're watching the recording of it, unfortunately, we won't be able to get to your question. I know Bryan had the numbers up earlier, so check out, you can check out our website or give us a call if you have any questions about any of the stuff that we talked about, or are wanting any other ideas for supports or things like that in your community. Please feel free to reach out to us.